At 17,000 feet above the Eastern Front, the July sun shimmered against the canopy of a battered Yak-1 fighter. Its engine roared at full throttle, straining, trembling, as if aware that this flight, this moment, balanced on the razor's edge between triumph and oblivion. Ahead of the Soviet pilot, two Messerschmitt Bf-109s streaked toward friendly lines, their silver fuselages glittering like knives in the morning light. Behind him, smoke trailed from a previous dogfight. His muscles ached. His lungs burned, but his hands were steady. He pushed the throttle forward, closing the distance to the trailing German fighter. The Messerschmitt zigzagged, diving sharply, then climbing, probing for an escape route. But the Soviet pilot held position like a predator that had already chosen its prey and would not be shaken. Inside the cockpit, the man's breathing deepened. His gloved thumb hovered over the firing switch. 200 meters, 150, 100. The German pilot finally twisted his head, realizing too late that someone was behind him. The Messerschmitt rolled right, climbing sharply. The Soviet pilot rolled with him, matching the movement perfectly, his yak shuddering under the stress but staying locked onto the enemy's tail. He fired. The 8-round burst stitched across the 109's fuselage. Smoke blossomed instantly from the engine cowling. At that exact moment, as he rolled beneath the enemy fighter, something extraordinary, something almost unbelievable became clear. This Soviet ace, who had just shot down his 6th German aircraft, who was maneuvering with deadly precision at thousands of feet above the earth, had no legs. Neither of the German pilots knew that the man outflying them wore 2 prosthetic limbs strapped beneath his flight suit. They didn't know he had learned to walk again only months earlier. They didn't know he had crawled through forests for 18 days, starving, freezing, refusing to die. They didn't know that he had once been told he would never fly again. But he flew anyway. His name was Alexey Maresyev, and his story, nearly forgotten outside of a few dusty archives, remains one of the most staggering examples of human endurance ever recorded in aviation history. Today, we're going back to the beginning, to the day he fell from the sky, to the weeks he crawled through wilderness with shattered legs, to the months he fought the medical boards, the regulations, and the limits of his own body, to the moment he returned to combat and became a legend. This isn't just a war story. It's a story about what happens when a human being refuses to accept the word impossible. Let's go back to where it all began. Alexey Maresyev was born in 1916 in the small Russian town of Kamyshin, a settlement of wooden houses, dusty roads, and the broad Volga River rolling endlessly to the south. His family was poor, his father a metal worker, his mother a homemaker. But the boy grew up with a fire inside him, a restlessness his teachers always noticed but never fully understood. He loved motion. He loved speed. He loved climbing trees, sprinting across fields, swimming against the current of the mighty Volga. Anything that tested his body, he embraced with an almost stubborn joy. And above all else, he loved aircraft. As a boy, he would stand barefoot in the fields outside Kamyshin, watching the rare biplane buzz overhead like a mechanical hawk. While other children shouted and pointed, Alexei fell silent. His eyes locked on the sky. Something inside him shifted, as if a hidden compass had suddenly found its true north. He didn't just want to fly, he needed to fly. But dreams cost money, and the family barely had enough for food. Alexei worked odd jobs after school, hauling wood, fixing fences, sweeping workshops. At 17, he joined a factory as a machinist. His pay was small, but he saved every kopeck. Then he discovered something that would change his life. His town was close enough to a local aero club, one of the Soviet aviation training centers that scouted young talent. The moment he learned that flying lessons were possible, He committed to it with single-minded determination. He walked miles to attend evening classes. He studied aircraft diagrams by candlelight. He practiced hand signals, navigation, engine mechanics. Instructors noticed his work ethic immediately. What he lacked in natural giftedness, he made up for in perseverance so fierce it bordered on obsession. By the late 1930s, Alexey earned a place in the Soviet Air Force. He trained on the Polikarpov I-16 fighter, fast, unforgiving, notoriously dangerous for inexperienced pilots. But he mastered it. When he graduated flight school, he wasn't the top student, but he was the one who never quit. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the largest invasion in human history, millions of Soviet soldiers were mobilized within weeks. And among them was Alexey, newly trained, newly deployed, and eager to prove himself in the sky. He could not have imagined that within a year, his life and his body would be changed forever. It happened in April 1942. Maresyev, now flying a Yak-1, took off on what should have been a routine patrol over the Kalinin front. German forces were entrenched below, pushing relentlessly toward the Volga. His squadron encountered a group of Luftwaffe fighters, veterans, experienced, deadly. The dogfight was brutal. Alexey engaged a Messerschmitt head-on, firing at close range. The German pilot broke away, but not before his wingmen slipped behind Alexey and fired a burst that shredded the Yak's radiator and control lines. The engine screamed. The cockpit filled with smoke. The aircraft began to die. Alexey tried to steer toward friendly territory, but his plane was losing altitude fast. The engine seized. The propeller froze. He was in enemy-held wilderness, thick forest, frozen marshes, miles from any known settlement. He crash-landed in a violent skid that snapped the landing gear and flung him headfirst into the canopy frame. Pain exploded through his legs. He blacked out. When he woke, silence surrounded him. No rescue teams. No radio contact. No food. No warmth. Just the endless Russian forest. His legs were mangled. He didn't yet know how badly. He couldn't walk. Standing was impossible. Crawling was agony. But he was alive. And so he began to move. He crawled on elbows and forearms, dragging his broken legs behind him. The ground was half frozen mud, half snow. His flight suit was soaked. His gloves tore on tree bark. His breath steamed against the icy wind. On the first day, he thought he would be found. On the second, he realized no one was coming. By day 4, delirium crept in. By day 6, infection had begun. By day 9, he hallucinated voices calling his name. He ate what he could: melted snow, pine needles, bits of bark. He followed the direction of animal tracks, hoping they led to water. He listened for distant engines, for footsteps, anything. Each night he expected not to wake up. But somehow, through stubbornness or miracle, he survived. On the 12th day, he heard something new, a faint chopping sound. Not a German patrol. Not artillery. An axe. Human hands. He moved toward it, inch by inch, dragging himself through the underbrush until he reached the edge of a small clearing. And there, chopping wood beside a cabin, stood a Russian villager. The man dropped his axe in shock when he saw Alexey crawling from the forest like an apparition, starved, frostbitten, unable to stand. Villagers carried him inside, warmed him with blankets, fed him broth, and sent word to the nearest Soviet unit. Soldiers arrived and lifted the unconscious pilot onto a sled. He had survived the impossible, but his ordeal was only beginning. His legs were dying. And soon, doctors would make a decision that would change the course of his life and Soviet aviation forever. When the Red Army medics finally brought Alexey to a field hospital, his body was barely clinging to life. Fever racked him. His pulse was thin as a wire. His legs, frozen, shattered, infected, had turned a sickening shade of gray. The surgeons gathered around him with faces heavy as stone. There was no debate, no alternative, no miracle cure waiting in some cabinet. Both legs had to come off. The infection had already spread dangerously high. If they hesitated, even for a day, Alexey would die. The doctors prepared him for surgery, but he was too weak to fully understand what was happening. When the anesthetic took hold, he was still whispering something, half delirious, half pleading, that no one could quite hear. When he woke again, the world felt empty. He reached for the blanket. He pulled it back, and what he saw was absence. Where his legs had been, now there were only bandaged stumps, one above the knee, one below. His breath caught in his chest. A cold, hollow dread expanded through him like ink spreading in water. The surgeons spoke softly, explaining that they had saved his life. But all he heard was, "You will never walk again. You will never fly again. Your war is over." For days, Alexey barely spoke. He stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment of his crash, every meter he had crawled, wondering if the struggle had even been worth it. He had survived the impossible, only to lose everything that mattered. He had fought to live. Now he wondered if he should have. But something began to shift. Slowly at first, like embers stirring under ash. Wounded soldiers visited him. Nurses encouraged him. One officer, a fellow pilot, placed a medal on his bedside table and said, "Heroes do not choose the shape of their battles. They only choose whether to fight." That sentence pierced through the fog. For the first time since the crash, Alexey considered a possibility he had never dared imagine. What if this wasn't the end? What if he could return, not as the man he was before, but as the man he would have to become? It was madness. Nobody in the Soviet Air Force had ever flown combat with two prosthetic legs. Even suggesting it to a superior officer could get him dismissed as unstable. But the idea dug into him like a hook, like a promise, like a challenge. The more he thought about it, the stronger it grew. If he had crawled 18 days through the forest, dragging dead legs behind him, refusing to quit, then surely he could stand. Surely he could walk. Surely he could fly again. The despair that had once drowned him began to harden into something powerful, something sharp, something unbreakable. The doctors had saved his life. But now, Alexey would save his future. And his war was far from over. The first time Alexey tried to stand on his new prosthetic legs, he lasted 3 seconds. 3 agonizing, trembling seconds before he collapsed, nearly ripping open his stitches. But he got up again. The second time, he lasted 5. The third time, 10. His progress was excruciatingly slow. The prosthetics were primitive, rigid metal shafts strapped to the stumps with thick leather belts. Every step sent shocks of pain up his spine. His skin blistered. The straps chafed raw wounds. But Alexey leaned into the suffering with the same determination that had carried him through the frozen forest. Walking became standing. Standing became pacing. Pacing became climbing. By the end of the month, he could move well enough to convince curious visitors that he was recovering nicely. But Alexey wasn't training to walk. He was training to fly. He began sneaking into the hospital courtyard at dawn, practicing movements he remembered from the cockpit, leaning left, leaning right, shifting his weight exactly as he would maneuver a yak fighter at high speed. Nurses watched from the windows, whispering, wondering if he had lost his mind. Soon the doctors learned what he really wanted. "You cannot return to flight duty," they said. "It's impossible. Regulations forbid it." He smiled politely and ignored them. When he was transferred to a rehabilitation center near Moscow, he immediately requested access to a grounded aircraft so he could train in a real cockpit. The staff refused, so he found a way in anyway. One night, accompanied by sympathetic soldiers, he was helped into the cockpit of an old I-16 fighter. It was cramped, narrow, completely unforgiving, but it felt like home. He practiced for hours, working the rudder pedals with the stiff prosthetic joints, pulling back on the stick, simulating takeoffs and landings until sweat soaked his uniform. The next morning, he filed a formal request. He wanted to rejoin his unit as a combat pilot. The medical board laughed at first. A legless fighter pilot? Absurd. Regulations required the ability to control rudder pedals with natural limbs. Prosthetics were not even considered. But Alexey refused to relent. He wrote letters, petitioned commanders, quoted doctors who believed in him, demonstrated that he could run short distances on his prosthetics, showed that he could climb into the cockpit unassisted. Finally, after relentless pressure, the Air Force gave him one chance, a single flight test. If he failed, he would be grounded for life. On the day of the test, Alexey climbed into a Yak-1 under the watch of skeptical officers. The engine roared to life. His heart pounded. If the prosthetic slipped, if the pain overwhelmed him, if anything went wrong, but nothing did. He took off smoothly, turned sharply, climbed, rolled, and flew with the precision of a man who had never left the sky at all. When he landed, the officers were silent. They had no words, only stunned disbelief. Alexey Maresyev had done the impossible. He was cleared for combat. The man who could no longer walk without metal legs was going back to war. When Alexey returned to his regiment, the reaction was immediate and mixed. Some pilots stared at him with awe. Others whispered behind his back. A few openly questioned whether they could trust a man with no legs to cover them in a dogfight. Alexey didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply tightened the straps on his prosthetics and prepared for his first mission. It came sooner than expected. A formation of German bombers, escorted by Messerschmitts, was reported crossing the front line. Alexey and his squadron scrambled into their Yak-1s and raced toward the intercept point. As he climbed into the sky, the familiar vibrations of the engine traveled up through his seat, into his spine, and something awakened within him. A feeling he had feared would never return. Belonging. This was where he lived, in the clouds, in the wind, in the chaos of combat. The German formation came into view. A block of Heinkel bombers, flanked by a swarm of fighters. Alexey dove first. He targeted a bomber, firing a clean burst into its right engine. Flames erupted instantly. The bomber veered off course, descending in a slow, dying spiral. His squadron shouted in disbelief over the radio, "Is that Maresyev? He hit one. He's back. He's really back." But there was no time to celebrate. Two Bf-109s latched onto his tail, firing bursts that stitched dangerously close to his wings. Alexey banked left, then snapped right, sharp, punishing turns that would have caused unbearable pain during his early recovery. But now the prosthetics were part of him, extensions of his will, tools he had mastered. Most pilots avoided high-G maneuvers after injuries. Alexey embraced them. He cut speed, forcing one German to overshoot. As the enemy fighter flashed past, Alexey rolled behind him and fired a burst that tore through the fuselage. The Messerschmitt spiraled downward. One more kill. His squadron commander watched in astonishment. The new pilot, the one they had doubted, was outperforming nearly everyone in the air. In the weeks that followed, Maresyev flew mission after mission, adding kill after kill. His precision, his spatial awareness, his unshakable calm, they were all sharper than before the crash. As if losing his legs had stripped away every unnecessary doubt, every hesitation, leaving behind a man utterly committed to the fight. Soon, he had 3 confirmed kills, then 4, then 6. By the time his record reached 7 German aircraft, Alexey was officially recognized as an ace, one of the elite group of pilots whose skill and courage shaped the war's air battles. But his most famous mission, the one that would cement his place in aviation history, was still ahead. A battle that would push him to the edge of endurance, a showdown against overwhelming odds, and a moment when his prosthetic legs would once again become the defining symbol of his unbreakable spirit. And that is where the legend of Alexey Maresyev truly takes flight. It was July 1943 in the opening days of the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank engagement in human history, and one of the most brutal clashes of the entire Second World War. The skies above the front churned with smoke trails, tracer fire, and the distant thunder of artillery. Every squadron in the region was in the air, fighting to tip the scale in their side's favor. On the morning of July 20th, Alexey Maresyev took off with a formation of young Soviet pilots, most of whom had far fewer hours of combat experience. Their mission: intercept a German raiding group heading towards Soviet armor concentrations. As they crossed into contested airspace, the radio crackled with tension. Enemy fighters, 10 o'clock high. Bombers behind them. Multiple aircraft, looks like Heinkels. Stay tight. Stay calm. Alexey scanned the sky. 12 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, fresh, fast, and aggressive, dived from altitude. The Soviet formation scattered as the Germans attacked with ruthless precision. Within seconds, 2 Soviet aircraft were hit. Alexey didn't hesitate. He pushed his yak into a steep climb, despite the strain on his body and prosthetics. The G-force pressed him into his seat, threatening to blur his vision, but he held fast. A German fighter crossed his nose. He fired a burst, clipping the wing root. The Messerschmitt trailed smoke and peeled downward, but the Germans were not finished with him. 3 enemy fighters formed up behind him, diving in coordinated attack. Radio chatter filled with panic.
Your courage
Maresyev,
us all.
Thank you.
3 behind you, break, break.
They said it was
You
impossible.
can't outrun them.
They were wrong.
Maybe he couldn't outrun
The
them,
fight continues.
but he could outthink them. Alexey pulled into a sharp, climbing left turn, an energy-draining maneuver few pilots attempted with prosthetic legs. The Germans overshot slightly, adjusting formation. At the peak of his climb, Alexey suddenly cut throttle and rolled inverted, dropping behind the trailing German. He squeezed the trigger. The burst hit clean. Another kill. But now he was low on altitude and dangerously exposed. A 4th German, unnoticed until now, swooped from above. Cannon shells ripped past his cockpit, shattering part of the canopy. A shard grazed Alexey's cheek, drawing blood. He steadied himself. Pain was irrelevant. Fear was irrelevant. Only the mission mattered. He banked hard into the enemy's arc, forcing the Messerschmitt into a turning battle. At this angle, precision mattered more than force. And in this moment, Alexey's prosthetics, stiff, unyielding, perfectly braced, gave him an advantage. His motions were exact, mechanical, efficient. The German broke first. Alexey fired a 3-second burst. The 109 exploded into flame, spinning toward the fields below. His squadron erupted in cheers. Maresyev got another one. He's unstoppable. He saved us. By the end of the mission, Alexey had downed 3 German fighters in a single day, bringing his total to 7 confirmed kills. When he landed, his commanding officer embraced him, a gesture rare in the stern world of wartime aviation. "You're not just a pilot," he said softly. "You're a symbol, a reminder of what the human spirit can do." And with that, Alexey's legend was sealed. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world Alexey returned to was utterly changed. Cities lay in ruins. Families mourned losses beyond counting. Millions of veterans struggled to find their place in a world suddenly too quiet. For Alexey, the transition was harder than most. He had spent years defined by combat, by danger, adrenaline, responsibility, survival. Now, for the first time since his youth, he faced a future without engines roaring behind him or tracer rounds streaking past his wings. He was offered positions within the Soviet Air Force, but none of them involved flying combat. Regulations still prevented double amputees from holding active pilot status in peacetime. So Alexey made a difficult decision. He retired from military aviation, but he didn't disappear. Instead, he threw himself into public service. He completed an education in civic administration, eventually becoming an official in the Soviet Veterans Affairs Department. His work focused on rehabilitation programs, employment opportunities, and medical support for wounded soldiers, men whose injuries mirrored his own. He visited hospitals regularly, speaking with amputees, encouraging them, urging them not to surrender to despair. Many could not believe the man standing before them, a national war hero, walking on 2 prosthetic legs without crutches or canes. He showed them how he strapped on the legs, how he trained, how he pushed through the pain. His presence alone inspired thousands. His story spread across the Soviet Union. Books and articles were written about him. Novels were inspired by his ordeal. Most famously, the celebrated Russian author Boris Polovoy published the story of a real man, a fictionalized but deeply emotional retelling of Alexey's survival and return to flight. It became required reading in schools, a symbol of endurance and patriotism. In the years that followed, Alexey married, raised a family, and continued to work tirelessly for veterans' rights. He was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor, recognizing not just his 7 aerial victories but the extraordinary courage behind them. Yet, despite the public accolades, he lived quietly, humbly. He never boasted about his achievements. He never portrayed himself as exceptional. When asked how he found the strength to crawl for 18 days, to overcome amputation, to return to the sky, he would answer, "I simply did what I had to do." A hero who never acted like a hero, that was the essence of Alexey Maresyev. More than a soldier, more than a pilot, Alexey Maresyev became a symbol, one that transcended the war, the Soviet Union, and even the era he lived in. His legacy wasn't built on numbers. Not the 7 aircraft he shot down. Not the medals he earned. Not the missions he flew. His legacy was built on something deeper, the refusal to surrender. When his plane fell from the sky, he crawled. When his legs were taken, he stood. When the rules said he could not fly, he proved them wrong. When doubt crept into the hearts of younger soldiers, he became the voice that told them they could rise. He showed a nation broken by war that hope could walk on metal legs. In the decades after his service, Alexey continued to advocate for amputees and disabled veterans. Long before words like accessibility or rehabilitation rights became common, he was fighting for them, quietly, persistently, with the same determination he had carried through the forest. He died in 2001 at the age of 84, leaving behind a life that seemed almost too powerful to be real. But it was real, and that is what makes it extraordinary. Today, Alexandra streets, museums, and airfields bear his name. Monuments stand in his honor. Pilots still read about him in military academies. His story is taught not just as history, but as philosophy. A reminder that the measure of a person is not the obstacles they face, but whether they choose to rise after falling. His message remains timeless. Disability is not inability. Suffering is not defeat. And limitations, whether written in regulations, carved into metal, or born from fear, are only real if we accept them. Alexey Maresyev never accepted them. He lived with a truth that every generation needs to hear. A real man, a real human being, is not defined by what he loses, but by what he refuses to give up. And so we remember him, not as a pilot without legs, not as a war hero carved into stone, but as a living example of what courage looks like when the world tries to break it. If his story moved you, if it reminded you of the strength people carry inside them even in their darkest moments, then share it. Keep it alive. Let it inspire others the way it has inspired millions. Because heroes like Alexey Maresyev do not belong to history. They belong to all of us.